that we're live and alive, because it's not just good enough to be live. We're live on TV right now, all of us. I mean, they only see my pretty face for now, but all of you participating. But there's also alive. We got to be alive every single day. Thank God for our blessings that we're here. We count our blessings. We're grateful. We're appreciative. And we're going to launch into today's discussion, which is the values that shape Judaism's civil code. And I think we're going to dedicate this whole week's shiurim to this discussion. Of course, different angles and aspects of it, so that we could get a good glimpse and understanding of the parsha from an interesting angle, and understanding what shapes Judaism's laws, as the Torah portion this week tells us, and to see and get a good, robust idea how it's different, how it stands out from secular law. Okay, so this is a real, what should I call it? I want it to be an engaging exploration of the values of Jewish law and the laws that they shape, because we know the Torah gives us how many laws? 613. And what's interesting you'll find is this week's Parsha, Mishpatim, starts off with the words V'ele, and these are. Now in English, if I recall correctly from my primary school days, which is many moons ago, we don't start off a chapter and. Nor do we start off even a sentence and. Yet the Torah does so. And Rashi right away comes to the rescue and tells us that when a verse starts off, these are, it's starting a new topic. But when it begins with the words and these are, it's a continuation of the past. So what was last week's Parsha? What did we read? Yitro, which was the Ten Commandments, the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. So the Torah is coming to tell us that just as those 10 special laws were given to us at Mount Sinai by God, so too all the laws that we're going to be discussing in this Parsha, even though they are from the category of Mishpatim. Let's see if you remember past discussions. We said there's 3 basic categories of laws in the Torah. Eidus, Chukim, Mishpatim. What's Eidus? Testimony. Testimony. Shabbos is a testimony to God's creating the world in 6 days and resting on the 7th. That's a testimony. Pesach, 6 weeks away. We sit down at the Seder, we eat matzah. Why do we do that? It's a testimony to God's emancipating our ancestors from slavery in Egypt, right? We eat cheesecake on Shavuos. We reenact the giving of the Torah. It's testimony. It's witness. It's remembering something that happened in the past. Then we have chukim. What are chukim? Statutory laws. Laws that are beyond our comprehension. You should not mix milk and meat. Why not? Everyone else enjoys their ham and bacon and cheeseburger sandwiches. Not us, because God said so. Why? Because God said so. I could give you every explanation in the world, but ultimately it's a statute. It's a law beyond our comprehension. And the ultimate chok is like the para aduma, the red heifer. It has elements that are incomprehensible, as are the laws of so many areas of purity and impurity. So many aspects of Jewish law don't make sense to us. We do it because God said so. Why can't I mix wool and linen? Because God said so. Okay? Then there are laws of this week's Parsha, Mishpatim, which we're going to get into in a moment. And Mishpatim are laws that are civil, tort law, that should make sense to us. And for the most part, they do. But we're saying we don't observe them because they're rational, because they make sense to us, but rather because Almighty God commanded them. That's the V'ele. And these are. Just as the 10 Commandments are from God at Sinai, so to the rest of these laws, we observe them just as God said at Mount Sinai. So what I want to do this week with you is to explore what it is that makes Jewish civil law Jewish. What makes it so unique and different to other systems of law, right? And what this means to us living in a society that's governed by non-Jewish legal system, and how that applies. So we're going to focus on the basic question on the purpose of law. What is law about? Is the function of law just to regulate society, to protect people's rights? Or would you say law should seek to shape society, to promulgate righteous conduct? Or does the law not interfere in your personal behavior, but it's just to protect the community at large? What should it be? If law should promote righteous conduct, then how far should it go? Should law interfere with our personal decisions? Don't we say That's the basics of freedom of speech and freedom of choice and freedom of. Mm. Yeah. So, as you say, every legal system at the end of the day reflects the values of who created it, who wrote these laws, what was behind it. Here in South Africa, there was an apartheid regime which was discriminatory, which did things that disadvantaged others. And so it was necessary for the new government in 1994 to formulate laws. By the way, some of these laws are still archaic and outdated. If you look at the marriage books, this morning I was asked to officiate a marriage. So I pull out my marriage book, and there's still outdated laws from the 1960s. And some of the language, you know what a single woman is called in this book of current civil marriages, and I still don't understand why they never changed it. If you're a single lady, you know what you're called? A spinster. Yeah. It's an English word, I know, but it sounds a little bit antiquated to me. Okay, there are other such strange terminologies in the book of current contemporary civil marriage, okay? But we all know the way a society perceives values, whatever that might be, liberty, autonomy, mutual responsibility, all these are expressed in many nuanced ways, and they're manifested in the laws. So, for example, I want to give you an example, and I want to hear from you. I didn't grow up in South Africa, so you're going to have to help me out with the way South African law is. I'm just trying to close this thing. Okay, drives me crazy, but if it's not bothering you, I'm going to leave it, because otherwise we're going to mess up our whole thing. So, for example, while all Western democracies consider freedom of the individual and equality for all to be basic values, I want to show you a distinction between what I understand as US law and what I understand is European law. And then I want to hear from you the South African version. Okay? So in US law, it's all about freedoms of the individual. Okay? Giving you your rights. And in many European countries, it's very different. The emphasis is on what? Equality. Okay, you familiar with this? Which is something interesting if I put it into recent context. You remember COVID? Not so long ago? So during COVID, in the US, there was havoc. It was crazy. If I think about it, it didn't make sense to me. I went to the United States for the Chabad Shluchims conference. I was the only one, and my kids, who was able to go from Johannesburg to the conference because all the South African rabbis weren't allowed into the US. They had to go through a whole screening process. Besides the point that travel bug that I couldn't travel for 2 years, got to me from the last time I traveled before that was 2019. So actually I was there January 1st, 2020. So it was like a year and a half till I actually traveled again, or 2 years. What was it? The whole of 2020, the end of 2021, almost 2 years. And finally, we were able to go. And I come to the US, whereas in South Africa, everybody was wearing masks. And we couldn't gather with more than 50 people together. And the shuls were constantly being closed and all the other crazy things we went through. In the US, nothing. Everybody's roaming the streets. If you were wearing a mask, it was an announcement that you're a liberal. And if you're not wearing the mask, you were normal. It was a different world. And I thought to myself, what's going on here? In wild South Africa, in the jungle, where it's supposed to be a place that freedom reigns and everybody does whatever they want, and everybody's following the laws. And in the US, where there's supposed to be civil obedience and all, it's the opposite. And then I realized the difference. Because if you notice, generally speaking, European countries impose a lot more draconian, strict, extreme laws, limits of freedom during COVID. And in the US, it was the opposite. Because the European legal system focuses on safety of society as a whole, equality, whereas the American system's emphasis is on individual freedom. And you saw that reflected during COVID in the way people were behaving. Because in the US, you have the freedom of speech and you have the freedom of of choice, etc. So that freedom expressed itself in people rebelling or saying, I'm not going to follow the laws that you tell me to follow because I'm not comfortable wearing that mask, and I'm not going to take those injections that you insist I take. You can't interfere with what I'm going to do. What just happened here? Did we just lose our power? Why did we lose our power? Did something just happen to the power? Give me a moment, ladies and gents who are joining us online. We better get our power back or the computers are going to die. A second. What just happened here? Why did everything turn off? Something happened. Huh? Why did this turn off? Pita. Okay, there we go. It's got the power's back. It seems like the power went off for a minute. Okay, let's get it back on. Let's see, is it back on? Okay, there we go. This is Africa. Things like that happen. Did anyone else have their power go off? I don't know if anyone else is charging anything, but it seems like the power went off for a moment here. So we're back. All right. What was I telling you before the power went off? I was saying the difference between okay, now tell me, where does South Africa stand with this? Is South Africa focused more on equality? I would think so, more like European law. Probably more similar to European law than to US law, right? Well, COVID here, for the most part, people were obedient. People, and the country here, South Africa had some of the strictest laws of all countries. Right? It wasn't the individual. Exactly. So it's more European style. Yeah, that's the way it appeared to me. But the point is, the practical result is that South Africa and European countries, and those that are focused more on equality laws, have more extensive welfare programs compared to the US, except that South Africa does not have. Europe tends to have that more. All right? But where do we see this in, we're going to look at Jewish law in a second. But I would say these values are often shaped by historical experiences. Here in South Africa, equality was missing until 1994, or there were some people more equal than others. So that's why the law here took on that equality emphasis. In the US, freedom of speech is a very strongly protected right. It's in the Constitution. And even hate speech, is permitted. And I would suggest people stay away from social media these days. But the truth is, I don't like to bury my head in the sand. But if you're on social media, boy, has hate speech gone through the roof. And it is extreme these days. And when we hear, on Shabbos, I was talking in Shul, I said, I've never experienced anti-Semitism in South Africa. I should never make these types of announcements. Because in 2018, I said I never experienced robbery or crime in South Africa. You know what happened to me? We got robbed terribly. I had a home invasion. After I said on Shabbos in Shul that I've never experienced anti-Semitism in South Africa, boom, that day I'm walking to Willowbrook to give my Shabbos afternoon shir. And as I'm walking, this car passes by me. And this, I don't want to say what, started cursing at me, you effing Jew. And it shook me up. First time ever experiencing that here. But yeah, yep. But by the ANC, yeah, that's their role models. I mean, but the words he threw at me were very, very sick. But but nevertheless, pardon? I gave him no reaction. Zero. I just kept walking. But that being said, I still do think that in US, which is officially a good friend of Israel, in Europe, where many countries profess to be good friends of Israel, you experience a lot more anti-Semitism on the streets. The basic difference I've been seeing since October 7th was that while the US was a strong ally of Israel, the government was strongly supportive of Israel. On the streets, you saw the most vile, horrific rhetoric, protests, demonstrations with the freedom of speech. And in Europe, where I would say freedom of speech is more controlled, and probably because in the past Europe has seen that their freedom of speech has turned into tremendous hate, so they have more limit on hate speech. But nevertheless, in Europe too, we've seen that vile anti-Semitism rear its ugly face again. Here in South Africa, where the government is openly hostile to Israel, openly. I mean, we've seen our charge d'affaires, good guy, who was just ejected from the country last week, and all these other things that we're experiencing and seeing. But nevertheless, in this country, we definitely see a lot less anti-Semitism.
They don't, I mean, the country and the society think
right. For the most part, but exactly. I mean, Europe is drenched in anti-Semitism. But either way, that wasn't the topic of discussion I wanted to talk with you about today. I wanted to talk more about this idea, which obviously lends itself, whether it's to anti-Semitism or other hate speeches. But the idea is that in the US, the value of freedom of religion is understood to require a strict separation of church and state. So you have freedom of religion, but there's a separation, right? So, for example, the government is not even allowed to provide funding for private religious schools. So when you have yeshivas getting government funding, it's usually not for the Jewish education or whatever religious education. It's more related maybe towards their secular education, or maybe towards some other equality element, but not towards a religious aspect, because that's not something the government could fund. It could fund protection. It could fund maybe food, but it cannot fund the religious aspect. I'll take questions in a moment. Let me just keep. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Government does not fund.
Right. Okay, that's valid. But the idea is that I'm trying to get towards is that in European countries, governments generally don't interpret freedom of religion in the same way. Right? Private religious schools can receive government funding in Europe, which is an interesting phenomenon. Okay? And the reason for these differences, I would say most likely is historical. In the US, the founding fathers, they experienced government restrictions on their freedom of speech, on their freedom of religion, and therefore they created very strong laws to protect those values in the United States of America. Those were the early pilgrims, the people who came and wanted that freedom of religion. Whereas the European countries, they don't share the same historical experiences. In fact, Europeans experienced fascism, the Holocaust, constant wars and invasions and all those other things. So this history shapes the European attitude towards freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and perhaps that's why they want to give more to compensate to religious discrimination of the past, and they limit and control hate speech, whereas in the US, as long as it's not infringing on other people, you have freedom of speech. So it's very interesting and very different. The Rebbe once lamented and commented, and in fact it was his last mimer, the last discourse the Rebbe gave before the 27th of Adar 1992, and I received it from the Rebbe in his hand, was Ve'ata Tetzaveh, a discourse in which he discusses the Parsha, which is going to be, let's see, this week is Mishpatim, next week is the double Parsha this year? I think it's next week's Parsha, which will remember the last discourse the Rebbe gave out. And in that discourse, he discusses that while America offers freedom of religion, and many devout religious Jews back in the Soviet Union behind the Iron Curtain fought tooth and nail. They were refuseniks and they fought the government for their religious freedom. But they come to a country that offers it to them, and instead of exercising their freedom of religion, they all of a sudden exercised freedom from religion, which is an irony. Either way, while every legal system is shaped by its underlying values, I would say this is precisely pronounced in the case of Jewish law. What do I mean? Let's talk about this. Because we know that Jewish law is not laws that we make up on our own. Maybe you remember last year's Talmud class. We have the written Torah, right? 5 books of Moses, the books of the prophets and the books of the scriptures. And in those books, we have the written law, 613 commandments, and then a lot of history that followed it. Along with those laws, we were given the oral law to help us understand those laws. In addition to that, our sages also they derived laws from the Torah and legislated laws. It's not biblical law, it's rabbinic law. We don't add to the Torah, we don't subtract from the Torah. But the sages felt in order to safeguard the Torah, they had to enact certain laws that will help protect the laws of the Torah, right? So let's understand first the God-given Torah values that guide Jewish law, because all the rabbinic laws are based on, either derived from, or they are legislated in order to protect the God-given laws. That's it. So that will give us understanding, coming from last week's Parsha where we had the Ten Commandments, and this week's Parsha in which we learn Mishpatim, the rational legal laws in Judaism. I think this will give us a good way to understand how Jewish law is shaped. And you may recall in a previous shiur, we discussed the basic values that guide modern society and the laws that were first introduced to the world by the Torah. And in fact, you might say that much of the world's laws come from Torah, because Christianity and Islam are, I don't want to call them offshoots, but are both based on the Torah. Okay, they both come long after Judaism, and much of their laws. So values such as sanctity of human life, human dignity, equality before the law, those were in fact revolutionary Jewish ideas in their time. Many people, including many enlightened civilizations, such as the ancient Greeks and Romans, did not value human life. Think about the Roman gladiators. Think about the athletics and of the Greeks, that if you weren't the perfect human specimen, you were worthless. Infanticide, is that the word? Killing infants, murder of infants, was something that was very common in that time. If a child was born and wasn't the perfect,
China was like that.
until recently. Yeah, exactly. But China has no religion. China is atheistic. So it's completely different. But the point I'm making is, most of Western society today, most of the value system within the world are based on Torah law. And so I want to see and understand how Jewish values that are either still novel themselves or applied in Jewish law, and look just and understand the difference between Jewish versus secular laws, and hopefully to get a better understanding and appreciation of the parsha we're reading this week. So that's why we're going to focus this week on that aspect. Okay, so I'm just trying to think where I want to go. I want to open with a question for you. Okay, so here's a question. What is law seeking to achieve? Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question. Okay, a few questions. Okay, a little exercise. You ever like some exercise? There's a mental exercise about different forms of rules and rule makers. Okay, so if you were a refugee given a few minutes to address the players before a game of football, and if you watched the Super Bowl last night or this morning, my kids had a mishigas. They had to wake up at 1:30 this morning. Not wake up, they didn't even go to sleep to watch the Super Bowl. And I, as a very mean dad, did not let them. And boy, did I get a little bit of a mapala for my kids. I said, you get school, you're not watching this at 1:30. You could always watch the replay. They're like, why can't you watch a replay of your shears? I said I could, and I do. You know the story about the fellow who the rabbi tells him to come to shul for the Yom Kippur service. He says, Rabbi, I can't come. It's the super, not the super. In America, then is the World Series. In South Africa, then is what? What's the golf tournament called? Open U.S. The U.S. is open. Whatever it's called. There was some kind of special sport going on. So the rabbi says, you could watch a recording of it afterwards. He says, brilliant idea, Rabbi. Can you record your Yom Kippur sermon for me? I'll watch it afterwards. So let me ask you this question. If you were the I said refugee, I meant referee. Apologies. If you're the referee, okay, I had to get your attention. If you're I can't read my notes very well. Sometimes I'm reading notes that I say to myself, And then I forget what I wanted to say. I'm like, refugee, what do I say here? Okay, if you were the referee and you were given a few minutes to address the players before a game of football or soccer, okay, what would be the top three things that you would say?
Don't hurt you.
Huh?
Don't hurt physically you enemy.
You know,
Kick them, don't
in rugby and in football, they really give each other a nice hiding. Okay. Now, if you were the coach and you're given a few minutes to address the players before the game, what would be the top three things you would say? Maybe you did watch the Super Bowl last night. Were there good commercials this year? Was there good entertainment? And finally, third question. Okay, irrelevant. You know what? I don't want to go too much into that. But what's my point here? We're going to look at Sakal law, and we're going to come back to my questions in a moment. I don't think that's really necessary. Well, I'm actually going to go back to see God as the referee of the world as a team. We'll get back to that in a second. Now I got to remember where we were going. Okay, I'm going to read something to you in a moment. There's a Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone familiar with the Declaration of Human Rights? It was drafted by Emmanuel Joseph, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Sias, something like that, okay, of Marquis de Lafayette, in consultation with Thomas Jefferson. Okay, it was approved by the National Assembly of France in 1789. And the declaration was a core statement of the values of the French Revolution. And it had a major impact on the development of popular conceptions of liberty and democracy, not only in Europe, around the world. Because, you know, that was an era of uprisings, of revolutions, of monarchies being overthrown, of democracies or other kinds of government that were not dictatorships, as was common till very recently. They were being overthrown. There were coups d'etats going all over the world. And the Declaration of Rights describes the function of law. And let me read it to you what it says, and we'll unpack it together. It says as follows: liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. Hence, the exercise of the natural rights of each man has no limits except those which assure to the other members of the society the enjoyment of the same rights. These limits can only be determined by law. Okay, in a nutshell, let's paraphrase that. It limits on freedom and only to protect others. Okay, let's continue reading this. Limits can only prohibit such actions as are hurtful to society. So any prohibitions enacted by governments should be to protect society. Nothing may be prevented which is not forbidden by law, and no one may be forced to do anything not provided for by law. Okay, let's unpack this. According to the Declaration, every person has the right to do as they wish. That's liberty. Okay? So unbridled, let's talk, excuse me. Let's just unpack that for a moment. If the law says you could do whatever you want, what's going to happen? Chaos, thank you. Absolutely, anarchy. Okay? So when you have limitless rights, what's going to happen? We're going to have a chaotic society, right? Society is a collection of individuals, each with their own inclinations, which is why the Mishnah says in Pirkei Avot, we should pray for the welfare of the government, even an ANC government. Why? We don't like them. They're anti-Israel. They're maybe anti-Semitic in some ways. Why should we pray for their welfare? Says the Mishnah, because without a government, we're going to have anarchy and chaos in the world. So better to at least have a system of government. You know, we don't like them, so let's pray for a better government. But the point is, we need to have systems in place, because without those systems, each person is going to do according to their whims, according to their own inclinations, according to their desires, according to their goals, according to whatever they want. And if there are no limits on each other's rights, what is going to happen? people are going to deny the rights of others, and we're going to have a world in a perpetual state of conflict. And that's why it was so important to have this declaration that would protect the rights of the individual. Okay? And this is the role determining the necessary limits to each individual's personal rights, so to preserve, to protect the rights of the society. And that makes sense to us, right? And that's why society sanctions institutions of government to set up and enforce a legal system that will protect the rights of each individual, will maintain public order. And the law sets the limits to maintain that order. In the US, I grew up with understanding the whole idea of government by the people, for the people. That's what it's about. But, my friends, let's take a moment and look at another type of law. So in secular society, we say every person has the right to liberty. And that's good. And we need that, because without those protections, we as a Jewish people suffered throughout history. And we need to maintain public order, of course. But let's turn for a moment to examine how the Torah perceives itself and the Torah's laws, like in our Parsha, where we see the laws being set before the people. In fact, Rashi tells us, what does it mean, the law to be set before the people? Keshulchan ha'aruch. What's Shulchan Aruch? A set table. In fact, the basic code of Jewish law, what is it called? I just gave it to you, hint, hint. Shulchan Aruch, the set table. What's a set table? You come home. If the table's not set, you got to set it yourself. Why do people like going to restaurants? Yeah, the table's set for you. My friend came to a restaurant and he ordered a bowl of soup. He asked, what's the soup du jour? They said, it's bean soup. He says, it's bean soup. What is it now? Anyways, he gets his soup and there's no cutlery. So he calls over the waiter. He says, could you do me a favor and taste the soup? Waiter says, why? Is there something wrong? He says, do me a favor and taste the soup. Waiter says, does it not taste right? Should we get you something else? He says, all I asked you to do is taste the soup. The waiter says, but where's the spoon? Aha. Okay, alta maisa. Either way, Shulchan Aruch is a set table, and the way the Jewish law is set before you, Hashem tells Moshe to set it before the people that it's easily accessible and noticeable. They should know, they should be able to discern right from wrong, and it shouldn't be something of guessing work. So this week's parsha is exactly that. The laws are set before us. And for the purpose of our discussion, we're not going to address the laws regarding religious conduct, because that's not this week's parsha. Last week, we had two sets of tablets, right? One set of tablets was theological. It was the laws between man and God, as you could see right there, right? I'm the Lord your God. You should have no other God before me. You should not swear God's name in vain. Honor Shabbos and keep it holy. And law number 5, which actually seems to be more societal, but is still in the right side between man and God. And what is that? To honor one's mother and father, because to remind, just as God creates everything, our parents bring us into this world, and that's why it's included in that side. But the second set of the tablets is all completely interpersonal laws, right? But this week's parsha is focused not on religious law, not on theology, but on interpersonal laws. That's what I want to focus on. And so we're not going to talk about the laws of kosher. Kosher is between man and man or between man and God? God. What about Shabbos? Okay. What about shatnez? Shatnez, wool and linen. Will you hurt anybody if you're wearing a garment of wool and linen? No. But if we disregard God's laws, then the question is, how careful are we really between societal law? But nevertheless, I'm not going to talk about those laws. Those laws are between you and Hashem, and no one else is to interfere or judge you for. However, the laws, we are going to talk about the laws in this week's parsha. And those are the laws between man and man. Okay? And that the Torah says. Who judges you for those laws? The God. We have courts of law. We have a Beis Din. And if there's a litigation, if there's conflict between two individuals, where should they go? To the judges. and the judges have to have police officers to enforce the law. So let's talk about the Torah's laws governing interpersonal conduct, civil, criminal law, okay? And this is right after the Ten Commandments, meaning, does God start off right after the Ten Commandments with telling us the laws of Shabbos and kosher, or between telling us how to treat each other? Which one? How to treat each other, right? Immediately the Torah begins with the civil laws, with the criminal law. These are the laws you shall set before them. That's the parsha this week. And the verse specifies, it starts off, Ve'ela, and these are the laws being given, Asher tasim lifneihem, to place before them. Who's them? The people, the Jewish people. Telling us that God is giving the Jewish people a system of criminal and civil law. That's what the parsha starts off with. These are the laws that we have to deal with. So this raises a question: why is there a need for God-given Jewish law in the realm of interpersonal conduct? That's what I wonder. Think about it. Ritual matters, how to keep Shabbos, how to observe kosher. I understand that's in the realm of religion, right? Because after all, these are ritual matters. These are between man and God. I need laws to be written to tell me how to conduct myself in those matters. But why should Judaism impose itself on civil and criminal matters? Why can't human beings just get together? Let's have our systems of law. Why do we have to go to a Beis Din? Why can't we just go to Bloemfontein? Isn't that where the civil, the judicial branch of government is? And if you have a problem, just go straight to the courts. Why do we first have to go to a Beis Din? And only if the Beis Din can't handle it, then you go to the courts, right? So this is the question we want to know, because in general, societies have laws. So there must be a difference, a distinction between the way Judaism sees these interpersonal laws and the way society sees these laws. So to start, I want to read to you from the Abarbanel. Tomorrow, Bli Neder, I will try to put the texts into the slides. But for today, I didn't manage to do that. We had to get the slides together, and there's only a limited number of hours in a day. So if I could get them in, I will. If not, you'll at least have some slides to discuss this. Says the Abarbanel. You're all familiar with Abarbanel. We discussed him in one of our previous courses, the colorful profiles in Jewish history. We talked about him. Rabbi Dan Yitzchak Abarbanel was a rabbi in Spain, was a brilliant figure, and he was also I'm trying to remember what we said about him. He actually wasn't in Spain, he was in Portugal. And he was a minister for the King Alfonso V of Portugal. He lived during the Spanish Inquisition, and he suffered tremendously during the expulsion by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And he lived in a very tumultuous time of Jewish history, as you can imagine. So he wrote a beautiful commentary on the Torah, and he says as follows. Every human society requires laws. What is the advantage of God's Torah laws over the legal system set up by the nations? Why does the verse state, and here's the law, the verse in our parsha, Ve'ela mishpatim, these are the laws, asher tasim lifneim, that you should place before them. Okay, so what's the advantage? These are the laws that you should place before them. What's specifically about these laws? Okay, it's telling us that these laws are unique divine system that God gives us. What's unique about it versus secular society's laws? Says the Abarbanel, the reason for this is that the divine laws contain elements absent from other legal systems. Otherwise, God wouldn't have to give us these laws. God's laws are based on the principles of compassion and goodness, and society's laws are oftentimes written by individuals based on their own agendas. So Abarbanel is telling us that the Jewish legal system is very different than the secular system. And therefore, because Jewish system is based on compassion and goodness, it is important for us to understand that these are the laws that Hashem says place before them. What is the emphasis here? Let's look in another verse in the Torah portion, okay? And the underlying principle of Jewish law is what the Torah tells us. Shamar tishmerunas mitzvahs Hashem Elokeichem. You should diligently observe the laws of Hashem your God. Asher tzivicha, that He commanded you, says Moshe. Va'asisa, you should do. Hayashar v'hatoy b'einei Hashem. Do that which is right and good in God's eyes. Very good. So Torah law doesn't see its purpose as just protecting people's individual rights. By preventing us from harming each other is not enough. The Torah wants to guide us to be compassionate. So it's not just about protecting the rights as secular law is protecting, but by doing what is right, which oftentimes is missing in society. So under the terms of what we said before, right, secular law sees its purpose very much like the referee. The goal of a referee is not to ensure that the players play well or they excel or win. What's the purpose of the referee? The coach will make sure you win. What's the purpose of the referee? Just to regulate the players, to ensure they're not infringing on each other's rights, that they're not knocking the living daylights out of each other, right? So to make sure there's no unfair advantage being rules of the sport that are being broken, but within the boundaries of the sport, from the referee's perspective, it's free for all. Knock each other out, right? Game style, tactics, individual performance, that's beyond the referee's purview. That's your freedom. You do what you want. A nice little maisala. The psychology instructor says, how would you diagnose a patient who walks back and forth, screaming at the top of his lungs 1 minute, and then sits in a chair weeping uncontrollably the next? A sports coach. So my friends, the Torah, there's a system of criminal and civil law, and you should place it before the Jewish people. Why? Because God, who is giving us these laws, the Torah's lawgiver, I would say is more like the coach than the referee. Coaches also want their players to keep the rules of the sport, right? Because that's important, but that's not the definition of their role. Their role is not to enforce the rules. The coach's goal is to guide their team, the players, to succeed, to excel, to be able to defeat the other team, right? And so the coaches instruct their players about playing style, about tactics. The coach coaches them to get the best out of them. And in order to achieve their goal, what do the coaches do? They need their players to adhere to certain standards of professional conduct on and off the field. And players that violate those rules are disciplined and could be excluded from the team because they're not playing right. But a coach's goal isn't regulating the players, isn't ensuring compliance. It's helping their players succeed to the best of their abilities. And in that sense, I want to say, secular laws like the referee regulate society to keep within the rules. And God, or the Torah, I wouldn't say, is like the referee. But rather, I would say the Torah is more like the coach. Hashem is the coach. The Torah is the playbook of the coach. God isn't satisfied with us keeping off each other's throats and following the basic law to guarantee that. I would say God as our coach wants us to succeed, wants us to excel, to be right and to do good. As the Torah says, V'asisa hayashav hatov, you should do what's right and what's good. God's playbook is to teach us how to be good, how to excel, how to win as human beings in this world. Which is why our discussion from 2 weeks ago, God gives us freedom of choice. God gives us the Yetzer Tov, a good inclination. But equally gives us the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. You have freedom of choice. You decide what's good. But Hashem says, I encourage you, I implore you, I beg you to do the right thing. So the basic difference between the purpose of Torah and Western secular law is that the secular law aims to regulate society, While Torah law, I would say, aims to
Educate.
shape and educate society, exactly. Which is why you could see that in secular society, people go to jail and learn how to become better criminals. Jail, incarceration is not a prescribed punishment in Torah. It is very uncommon. It's rare that you find imprisonment, incarceration as a punishment in Torah. It happens sometimes. It happens mostly as a holding cell until we can determine what the verdict should be. In fact, in yesterday's Torah portion, we see one of the rare occasions. If a person strikes another person with a hard blow, but now we don't know, will the victim survive or not? We hold the perpetrator in a jail cell, yesterday's portion, until we see will the person recover or not, because the punishment is different. If he afflicted a blow that is fatal, then what's the punishment? Yes, it's death. You're right. And if it's not, then he has to give riboy, tsar, and boshas. What's that? He has to pay for the damages, compensation. What compensation? Well, it depends. The Torah says literally an eye for an eye, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, a wound for a wound, etc. What does that mean? The compensation for. So now we have to determine how much does he have to pay. So the Torah says you're going to hold that person until we determine what the actual damage is. But otherwise, we don't have incarceration in the Torah. In society, people get into jail and they learn how to become better criminals, more adept at their skill of scamming society and hurting others. So we see a big difference. And while secular law is satisfied with protecting people's rights and infringements, the basic approach to any issue is, are anyone's rights being violated? That's the secular law's perspective. From the successful management of society, that's sufficient. If nobody was infringed upon, if nobody's rights were violated, all right, we did our duty. But Jewish law has a far more ambitious goal. The Torah wants to shape society and cultivate it as a compassionate and moral community. That's the Torah's perspective. And therefore the focus is on people doing the right thing. And its entire frame of reference is, what is the right thing to do? So whereas society is focused on rights, Torah is focused on obligations. Very good. Secular law says, are anyone's rights being violated? Torah law says, you have a responsibility. Did you hold up your responsibility, your obligations to society to be the best you can be? And so I think this is a very fundamental value of Jewish law. And the parsha is setting up for us this week the mission statement of what's right, the right thing. And right after the Ten Commandments comes this set of laws. Jewish law goes beyond the protection of rights. It concerns itself with to do what's righteous, to do what's right. Okay? And the difference, I would say, I want to look here from something the previous Rebbe said, that is, in today's Hayom Yom. How do you like that? Read it in Shul this morning. Today's Chaf Beis Shvat, the yard site of Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka, 38 years. I remember her funeral like yesterday. I was there when she passed away, saw the pain in the Rebbe and all the Chassidim. You guys want take a little break from our discussion and tell you a funny story I heard from a friend, a couple of years older than me. His brother was in a grade younger than me, but he was about 11 years older. This guy's name is Mo Gelber. He doesn't mind, he published the story, in fact. He likes telling the story. Mo was 11 years old in 1981. Or his name is Moshe, but he calls himself Mo. And he's a funny kid. He's one of those kids always getting into trouble in school. Not because he was a bad kid. He was just, he liked having fun and making prank calls and things like that. That's the kind of thing he was. Now, Mo's uncle is Dr. Robert Feldman, who just passed away recently. And he lived on President Street, a block away from the Rebbe. And he was the personal physician to the Rebbe and Rebbetzin. So whenever they had any medical concerns, he was there for them. And it happened in one day in 1981, little 11-year-old Mo was playing around in his uncle's office because his mother was Dr. Feldman's secretary, PA. So after school, he hung around, and let me tell you, the doctor's office was very busy to many late hours. And remember, in Dr. Feldman's office, he had a little play area for the kids, and this is where Mo would hang around. So one day, Mo is playing around there in the office. His mother had to help the doctor, and he's in his mother's office, and he's looking for the Rolodex, and he sees a card that says Schneerson, 1309 President Street, and a phone number. He says to himself, that's cool. I got the phone number to the Rebbe and Rebbitzins' home. Let me call them. You know, he's just a little kid. He didn't realize he's doing something that's not exactly appropriate to call. The Rebbe is a very busy man. Besides the point, the Rebbe wasn't home. I'm going to share with you a very important lesson for life. The Rebbe was a very busy man, as you can imagine. He carried the shoulders, the weight of Yiddishkeit. I've told you many such stories, and I'm sure you know of many stories about the Rebbe's care and concern for all of Am Yisrael, for the world at large. Anyways, he decides to call, and he figures he'll talk to the Rebbe, Rebbitzin, whoever answers the phone. And of course, the phone rings, and he hears an elderly Russian accent. The Rebbitzin must have been over 80 years old then. And she says, hello. And now he lost his courage. All of a sudden, he got scared. What's he going to say to the Rebbitzin now that she answered the phone? So in his scared state, instead of saying anything, he starts making funny sounds. He goes quack, quack, moo, moo, meow, meow, woof, woof. He's making these funny sounds, as a 11-year-old kid does, and then he hangs up. But then he decides, I had a chance to talk to the Rebbitzin. So he calls her again. But again, he lost the confidence, and he did the same thing, made more funny sounds. Now let me tell you, nobody knew about this. This was in March 1981. 6-7 months passed. It's Sukkot, which is usually September, October time, right? It's Sukkot time, and they were having a family Sukkot party. The cousins are all sitting in the family sukkah at Dr. Feldman's house on President Street. And somebody sends Mo into the house to go pick up one of the platters of food that weren't brought into the sukkah yet. So Mo goes into the house, and he's passing by his uncle's office, and he hears the phone ringing. And now in his uncle's office, there were two phones. There was the regular landline, I guess when you make calls or receive calls for the doctor's office, but there was a red phone. What's the red phone? Emergencies only. I forgot to tell you one more important point. His uncle told him very many times, as did his mother, don't touch the phones in the office. This is for patients and patients' families calling, especially the red phone. It's an emergency line. But Mo sees the red phone ringing and decides to pick it up. Hello, Piccadilly Circus. Or some other funny thing like that. And he hears the lady on the other line of the phone says, I'm sorry, I must have got the wrong number. He says, no, who are you trying to call? She says, this is Mrs. Schneerson from President Street. I'm trying to reach Dr. Feldman. I'm not feeling so well. He says, hold on a minute. Quack, quack. And he quickly gets his uncle. He says, Uncle, there's a emergency call for you on the red phone. Didn't I tell you not to touch that phone? Anyways, his uncle comes to the phone and checks in, and it's the Rebbitzin. She's not feeling well. She's asking the doctor to come check on her. A few minutes later, he's back in the sukkah, and he starts shouting at his nephew, how many times have I told you not to touch my phones, especially not the red phone? And what chutzpah you have? You called the Rebbitzin and made funny, quacky sounds? What are you, making prank calls to the most important lady in our community? How dare you? Anyways, he wasn't impressed with his nephew. He says, listen, I have to go to the Rebbitzins' house now because she's not feeling well. You put on your jacket and you're coming with me. The Rebbitzin wants to see you. And Mo says, oy vey, he didn't know what trouble he's in now. What he did, what the Rebbitzin going to do to him. He never met the Rebbitzin, but she's a very important person. She's the wife of the Rebbe. She's the daughter of the previous Rebbe. She's the matriarch of the community. And he started feeling like he's going to be in big trouble if she wants to see him. And so the whole way along to the Rebbitzins' house, which was one long block and a half, his uncle's giving him a mapala. How dare you do such a thing? You call the Rebbe and Rebbitzins' home and make prank calls, da da da. They come to the home, the door was already opened. And so they turn the door and come inside. And there's the Rebbitzin standing at the top of the steps at the landing. And with a beautiful smile on her face, she waves to him. And the doctor goes up the stairs and leaves his nephew at the bottom of the steps. He's standing there for a minute or two, and he gets a tap on his shoulder. There's a rabbi. It wasn't the Rebbe. It was Rabbi Gansberg, who was one of the caretakers in the Rebbe's house. He says, "Is your name Moshe?" He says, "Yes." He says, "Come with me." Now he says, "Uh-oh, now I know the trouble comes. This is the executioner. He's going to hang me in the gallows, or he's going to stick me in my head in the guillotine. Who knows?" And he brings him into the sukkah in the back of the house. And there were cookies and hot cocoa and orange juice. He says, "The Rebbitzin prepared these for you." That's the end of the story, okay? Nothing more, nothing less happened. But Mo, reflecting on the story, loves to tell the story over. That was his only meeting with the Rebbitzin. He thought he was going to be in hot water for what he had done. But the Rebbitzin firstly recognized his voice from 6-7 months earlier from his quack quack. And instead of reprimanding him, which his uncle had done, she had smiled and seen this is a boy, an 11-year-old kid calling for attention, seeking attention. Why else did he make these calls? And instead of her getting upset with him, she prepared him cookies and drinks. There's something so telling about the story that I feel like today the Rebbitzins' yahrzeit is a worthwhile story to tell. I'll tell you one or two other quick stories. The Rebbe and Rebbitzin were not privileged to have children of their own, even though the Rebbe blessed many people to have children, and those blessings came to fruition. So many people came with their problems, but the Rebbe and Rebbitzin did not have their own biological children. When somebody once asked her about, do you not feel bad that your husband blesses so many people, yet you and him don't have the blessing of children? She turned to all the children, and she used to come to many of the Farbrengens, and especially the Lag BaOmer parades, where thousands, tens of thousands of children would come from all over the tri-state area and all over the US and world, from Israel and other parts of the world to be there. England, France, people came from everywhere to be at the Lag BaOmer parades. You could watch some of the videos I put up here that now we have the videos playing. And she said, "These are my children." She saw all the Hasidim as her children. There was once an electrician in Crown Heights who would do work in the homes of people in the community. He was once called to the Rebbitzins' home. The Rebbe spent most of his day in 770. I forgot to tell you the part. I started introducing it. So I'll get back to the story about the electrician in a minute. You know that every day the Rebbe would come home very late at night because he would see people late at night in his office in private audiences in Yechidus. I believe Moshe and Fegi, you guys had a Yechidus with the Rebbe? Yep. I only had a public Yechidus. I never had a private Yechidus. Anyone else here had a private audience with the Rebbe? You were very lucky. But you could see on the screen videos. I found 2 videos of myself getting $1 and blessing from the Rebbe, although I got much more than that. I have in total $17 or $18 from the Rebbe on 12 different occasions. One of them I got a $5 bill. So those are the special blessings I cherish to this day. My parents only let me go on my birthday, and the Rebbe passed away just before my bar mitzvah. So I pretty much got one for each year of my life. Anyways, the Rebbe would come home late at night, and the Rebbitzin was always there to greet him, and they wouldn't just go straight to sleep after an exhausting day. I think the Rebbe also came home at midday to be with her as well. He would come home at midday. You know what they would do? They would sit down for tea. The Rebbitzin prepared biscuits and tea, and they would talk. Not about, I don't know what they talked about. It was a personal time. But every day they had a tea time with each other. And you could see that although the Rebbe had like the whole world on his shoulders, he was personally distraught when his Rebbitzin passed away in 1988. So today's her yahrzeit. And the final story I was telling you was about the electrician. The electrician comes to the home to fix the air conditioning. And he turns to the Rebbitzin, not knowing she's the Rebbitzin. He says, "You're not a Chabadnik, right?" So she laughs, like, "What do you mean I'm not a Chabadnik, right? Her father was the previous Rebbe, her husband's the Rebbe." She's like, "Why do you say such a thing?" He says, "Well, every home I go to in this community has a big picture of the Grand Rabbi. And you don't have a picture of him here. She says, I have him. I don't need the picture. Anyways, those are some stories of the Rebbe and Rebbitzin, of the Rebbitzin today. Yeah? Mm. Good story where Moshe is reminding me to tell you all. I think tells you a little bit about the Rebbitzin. She was a very modest woman. She wasn't, some Rebbitzins are out there, and she was very much behind the scenes. Now, for her in the earlier years, she had a job in the Manhattan or the New York Public Library, but I think she even drove there. But in the later years, for her health, she needed to go for a walk, but she wouldn't walk in the neighborhood of the Hasidim. I guess she felt that she didn't want to be that. I don't know exactly. She didn't want to be the center of attraction. Everybody was running after her. So she would there was a chauffeur, a driver. He actually just passed away about 2 weeks ago. His name was Chesed Halberstam. And his brother-in-law is Rabbi Levi Weinberg in this community. So just to tell you who he was. Rabbi Chesed Halberstam, I mentioned before, Rabbi Gansberg was the rabbi who was a caretaker in the house. Rabbi Chesed Halberstam was more like a driver and attendant, did shopping and things like that outside the house. So he drove the Rebbitzin to her errands and would take her to the park where she could go for a stroll without being the center of attraction in the community. And she was driving one day towards the park, and there's an area near the park called Park Slope. And as they're driving through there, they see a moving truck, and the movers are taking the stuff outside the house, and you see a lady standing out there crying, weeping uncontrollably. So the Rebbitzin asked the driver to go back, because she noticed this, to just check what the matter was. And she noticed that it was a lady, I don't know, and she never even asked what her religious affiliation, whether she was Jewish or not. I don't think that was relevant. She asked why she's crying with the movers. Usually when somebody's moving, it's a bittersweet moment, right? But you're not upset. And here the lady's crying outside her home. So when she inquired and investigated, the lady said she was being evicted for not paying the rent, and they were removing all her furniture. So the Rebbitzin asked how much rent was due. She pulled out her checkbook and paid all the arrears. That was her personality. Just to think, to care for another. That's what it means to be a leader in their right. So while I tell you many stories of the Rebbe, and there's a lot more stories known about the Rebbe, there are many stories also about the Rebbitzin. Many of them were only discovered afterwards that people shared, but I hope that does some justice. So let me share with you the Hayom Yom. Hayom Yom is a book that the Rebbe wrote in 1942-43, in which he had an entry for each day of the year, and this is his entry for today, Chaf Beis Shvat. And he's quoting his father-in-law, the previous Rebbe. And he says, Es seinen da zwei Chilukim. There are two types of laws. A Gesetz welches schafft Leben. There are laws that create life. And a Gesetz welches wird beschafft vom Leben. But there are also laws created by life. Human laws are created by life. Why do you think traffic robots are installed? Because when cars, or maybe even the days of horse and buggies, but probably the traffic lights came out after cars came about. Actually, maybe not. It could be some of them already installed still in horse and buggy days. But either way, you have traffic. We need to create laws of speed limits and seatbelts and robots, and right? So cell phones, etc. And then there are laws that create life. Torah laws are God-given. They're divine. Those divine laws are laws that create life. And the idea, of course, is explaining why human laws are subject to change. And it makes sense why they're subject to change. They're created by human beings. And maybe one day you thought you could drive 200 kilometers an hour and you could talk to yourself and you don't have to wear a seatbelt. But when we realized how many casualties there are coming, so the laws change and are adapted. And then, and they vary in different countries. But Torah laws are eternal. They apply everywhere in the same way. And so this is the context of what he's saying, and this is the Hayom Yom insight for today. So while we have a couple or more minutes, let's just explore this a little bit more. Secular law, you would say, understandably is man-made. They're shaped by life, by human experience. They are results and consequences of human condition. So the focus is on regulating humanity, society, and that's different in different societies and countries. And if you go to America and say a robot, they're going to think it's a mechanical device that's moving around, right? So you got to be careful with the vernacular, the word choices you make. But the Torah is divine. It existed before the world was created. In fact, Judaism teaches that the Torah was the very blueprint for the creation of the world. So Torah doesn't just regulate society, Torah creates and shapes it. And this is also one of the reasons why religious Jews relate to Jewish law differently than people relate to secular law. Think about this. In secular society, only someone that wants to be a lawyer or judge studies all the laws seriously. Otherwise, we know the laws we need to know, right? Lay people don't study law. We just get legal advice from a professional when we need it. But a traditional Jewish education includes intensive study of Jewish law. You go to a yeshiva, what's the focus of the study? We study tractates of Talmud, we study Shulchan Aruch, we study civil criminal law, all these things. Most of the Talmud is about laws. And this is because we see Jewish law not just as a technical system that we need to be in compliance with, but it's an expression of God's wisdom, and it aims to shape our character and guide our very action. And think about this. Do you ever see lawyers or anybody picking up law books and dancing with them? No. But every year when we finish the Torah, what do? Ay, 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 did it, right? We dance with the Torah because we realize it's not a human creation. It's divine. And so Jewish law, we study it in depth and we study it year after year when we review it constantly, because the whole idea is the whole approach of Torah, the values are internalized, they're made part of our lives. So that's the whole idea, that when we study Torah, we get a taste of divine law. And that's what I'm hoping that this week we're going to study the Parsha of Mishpatim, and each day live with the laws and ideas and the concepts that the Torah tells us in this week, and that we could internalize the idea of the difference of why we study this and what difference it makes to our lives. So, in summary for today, all legal systems we know are shaped by their underlying values, but this is especially true about Jewish law. And so, my friends, while secular law defines its purpose as maintaining social order by protecting people's rights, Jewish law sees its purpose as shaping society by guiding people to do the right thing. So while secular law is created by life to regulate society and is studied only by the legal professionals, the Torah law, which we're discussing here, creates life. It shapes society, and therefore that's a good reason for us to all study, engage, and internalize the laws of the Torah. Please God, tomorrow we're going to open our discussion with, when is doing the right thing an obligation? Is it something that's voluntary? Is it optional? Is the Torah law a smorgasbord, a buffet? Can you pick and choose what you want? I'll say very clearly, Judaism is not an all or nothing proposition. But nevertheless, it's also not a smorgasbord. These are called the 10 Commandments, my friends. They're not called the 10 Suggestions. So tomorrow we're going to discuss that, and we're going to see how they shape us, and we're going to look at some case studies that will get us a little bit more engaged in the tension between personal rights and doing the right thing, and we'll explore some ways in which practical Jewish law is very different from the way we see secular law. Hope you enjoyed today's discussion. Enjoy lunch, enjoy the bingo and art, and see you tomorrow morning where we have EFT pearls and tomorrow's discussion about